God is like the sun. You cannot always look at it, but without it, you cannot look at anything else. The way we find ourselves is by staring into the sun.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Staring into the Sun. You are seeing us in video in our beautiful selves.
God help them all.
That's right. We are trying it again. You have found us on the interwebs, either on YouTube or podcasts app, to Staring into the Sun, where we examine issues of the head and the heart, mental health, spirituality, psychology, theology. We dig into those areas to try to share things with you that might be useful for you for your own personal transformation and in your world. So here I am. I'm Dr. Rob Gibson. I'm a psychologist hailing from Colorado, and I'm joined by my beautiful brother.
Yes, and I am Pastor John Gibson. I live in Ohio. Pastor a church here called Living Hope. Yeah.
That's right. So welcome. We're so glad you're here. While you're here, take a moment, hit subscribe, hit like on whatever you're at, and share it with other people. We talk about all sorts of issues that are relevant to you. We've talked about forgiveness. We've talked about good and evil. We talk about anxiety and depression. We talk about spiritual issues. And we think those are relevant for the church and relevant for people that are going to therapy and relevant for everyone. But we've found that a lot of times the interconnection either in, we take our mental health somewhere and we take our spirituality somewhere. And John and I believe that we are integrated people, and mind, body, spirit. And so we talk about them together. So that's why we're here. So glad you're here. Take a moment to like and subscribe, share it with other people so that we can share this, what we have, with more people.
Yeah. What are we talking about today, man?
All right, my brother.
We're going to stare into the sun together.
So, yeah.
It's not sunny here. It's raining. But
And if you're new, just briefly, the reason we have the staring into the sun metaphor, that's why we call it that, is that it's from a metaphor from a writer named G.K. Chesterton, and it's about this idea that when you look at something that's impossible to look at, you can't contain it, you can't adequately describe it. In the light of it, everything else can make sense. And so what we want to do is we want to stare directly at those things that are hard to look at and hope that we can make some sense of the world around us as we do that. And so that's why we call it Staring into the Sun. So here we are. I think today, something that's been on my mind, especially as we look towards, in the church calendar, we're marching toward Easter.
Oh,
I'm sure
my
you're
gosh.
well aware of that, John.
Wait a second. It's Easter is close? No way.
So the way I think of it is, April is to accountants as Easter is to pastors.
Yes. Yeah. I'm just hanging by a thread, man. No, it's good. It's just busy time of year, right? So good.
That's right. Anyone who's a pastor at this time of year is aware that Easter is coming, and it's a sacred time where a lot of the pinnacle points of what it means to be a Christian come together. And I think it's relevant for us to talk about the issues of despair and hope today. That's what I want to talk about with you, John. I've been thinking about this in my own personal life and in my time and relationships with my patients. The issue of despair and hope, and how integral it is to life, and also how I think it would be good for us to try to put some words to what we think happens. How, when you find yourself in a place of despair, how you find hope, and how you find hope that's actually useful to you instead of fantasy or something like that, because despair is pretty gripping. So I deal with despair a lot, and try to help people find hope and change, and I think that's in your realm as well. So I thought we'd dig into both of those a little bit today in light of Easter, which is a pinnacle point of both despair, death, as well as hope, resurrection.
For me too, I think I was just talking about this past Sunday, and this may be down the road just a second from our conversation, but it came into my mind. I think Easter exposes the reality of our dysfunction with hope too, especially as Christ followers. Jesus had a description for Pharisees in his day, and Pharisees were part of the religious sect of Judaism. They were religious people. They were people who were kind of professional hopesters, I would call them. But yet he had a name for them. He called them whitewashed tombs, right? So on the outside, they were one way. They proclaimed one thing, and yet on the inside, they were the opposite of what they proclaimed. And we kind of we leaned into that on Sunday. A lot of times in the church, we kind of pin the Pharisees as these, jerkwads who did all the the wrong things in the ancient world. And yet oftentimes I think we can identify them with this reality in particular as Easter approaches. As Christian people, we're meant to be people of hope, and yet oftentimes our lives underneath the surface of our he is risen indeeds expose a whole nother reality, right? Where we become seekers of hope, and yet we consistently struggle with the reality of despair. And so, I'm very interested in this conversation. I think from your perspective, maybe we should just take a moment and just kind of talk about the definition of what is despair, because sadness, depression, anxiety, what actually putting our finger on what despair is. Even
I'd like to get to that. I think when you were talking, I was thinking, we can often have the veneer of hope, right? Yep. I think that's what I think of with the whitewashed. When you said that, it made me think of, scenarios. Say when someone finds out that they've had someone close to them die, or they've lost a child, and they're in despair. The thing that is impossible to hear in that moment is, something like, oh, it's okay, they're in a better place. That's like the veneer of hope. When you're in the midst of pain, what you don't want to hear is something like that, because it's not true hope I can grasp, because I haven't really wrestled with the fact that this is so despairing. And so I think of that when I think of whitewashed tombs, our struggles to enter into people's despair. And I think myself, and I think anybody listening can maybe resonate with times that we failed somebody else by just kind of flailing, not knowing what to say when somebody's in despair. And it's difficult to sit with because it's really, really painful. And we might say something like that isn't real hope.
Yeah.
It's maybe, a statement or something we use to wash over it.
It's interesting to me too, in that reality. Oftentimes we make statements of things that we wish were true in our own lives in a way to again, it's that veneer. Sometimes our language that we use, especially in the church, and again, this past week we talked about this on Easter Sunday. In 2 weeks, everybody's going to be saying He is risen, and then I actually did it this past week. I just said it off the cuff, and the entire congregation, He is risen indeed. I'm like, no, not yet. In 2 weeks He'll be risen. But everybody's real practiced at that. Our language even kind of perpetuates this reality of the veneer, right? How many of us will stand on the mountaintop and proclaim, yes, Jesus will bring you hope, somehow as if saying it louder and to more people will actually make it true in our own lives. You know what I mean?
And it doesn't actually bring hope. What actually might bring hope is something much more real and tangible, right?
Yeah, and I think my point too is, and I talk a lot with folks about this reality, that hope is something experiential, Just talking about what hope is, or talking about that what hope is, doesn't actually mean you've had an experience of hope. Those are two totally different things. And I'm a firm believer as well in just the reality of how, as a Christ follower, I believe hope is directly connected to an experience of relationship with Jesus, which is also something I think that is just a big issue within the church itself, that people spend a lot of time talking about Jesus and who He is, and there's this disconnect between our head belief and our heart experience. And I think maybe hope lives in that place too. A lot of us, again, if we talk about it enough, somehow we'll experience its reality in our life. But hope can, and my own experience, can be a fleeting thing sometimes too, where I know what it is and I want it, but maybe my lack of experience of it leads me just to try to have that artificial veneer of hope, as if somehow if I just believe enough, it will be true,
Yes. Yeah. Yes, if I work hard enough or pretend hard enough, it'll be true.
That makes me cringe a little bit, because it's true. If I pretend hard enough, because it's true, right? How often do fake it till you make it kind of thing? I don't how many times I do that in life. But really, I think the outcome of that a lot of times can lead us to just some really despairing places, because we spend so much time pretending, all the while this lingering, I'm not experiencing the things I'm pretending to experience. At some point it all comes to a head, and we are living in this reality of, man, I'm a mess. I'm despairing, and I went for a long time and nobody knew it because I was faking so long, because I was shameful or whatever the reason is, why we pretend. And yet it kind of escalates the reality of despair in our lives under the surface, for sure.
Yeah. So what is despair? I'll take a try.
Take a swing, man. Didn't you go to school to learn this kind of stuff? Like,
no,
Dr. Rob, give us.
They taught me how to photocopy paperwork. No, I'm just kidding. I always think that when I'm having trouble sending a fax, I'm like, they didn't have a grad school class for sending a fax.
Gosh, like I went to school to learn how to be a pastor and never learned how to write a sermon. So like,
Yikes!
Or never had to know he taught me in college. Isn't that funny? Oh
man.
Yeah.
So despair. I think what I see pictures when I think of it. Like being in the dark, or being covered in pain, and despair is like the truth resonating deep within that there's no one coming.
Ooh.
There's no help coming. There's no one coming. This is it forever. There's never going to be light. There's never going to be anything good. It's that feeling, that belief that it's really true, that nothing's coming, no one's coming. That's the picture I get of despair. I don't know if that's like, Webster's definition of it, but
yeah. I think that's how I would describe it, just from my perspective. I kind of mentioned this before, but for me, despair is concession. And it's conceding to the reality of death or brokenness or some reality in my life that it will never change. So I think in that sense too, despair is something of there's a personal participation in crossing the threshold towards despair. Whereas before we have experiences of trauma and brokenness in life that inflict the outcomes of those trauma experiences, whatever that is, looks like darkness, depression, anxiety, all those things, sadness, grief, sorrow. But this crossing over this some imaginary line towards despair is both the outflow of trauma and the participation of surrendering to the reality that it will never change and I'll never be better, and that I talk about that a lot with my faith community, of how despair or conceding to the reality of something in our life is as much the responsibility of, and I'd love to hear you talk about this. I believe it's as much the responsibility of the traumatic experience as it is the person who's been hurt participating in conceding to that this will always be the way it will be. I know sometimes we can believe lies and brokenness so much that we can't see a way out, but there is something of a conscious choice to concede, I think.
Or to participate. I think it's somewhere in the realm between concession and, I don't know, the word that comes to mind is crushing, right? Like being crushed by the experience and needing the not the infiltration, but like the infusion of somebody else that has hope and the capability to help. Because I think you're right to a sense. I mean, I think there are ways that life, crushes us, and where the only reasonable outcome is to feel despairing, and there's ways we participate in. We add to it, or we participate in it ourselves, in our own minds or in our own beings, for lots of complicated reasons, but engaging with the belief that there is no one coming and there is nothing. But I would like to hang out in the gray area. I don't know if it's all choice. I wouldn't want.
Oh yeah.
I don't think you're saying that.
Yeah.
I think it's this combination of us ourselves participating, and also the need for the provision of hope from some external place. I think I think that needs to break through as well. But that requires a willingness to the possibility that something could break through, right? Like
Yeah.
a willingness to believe that something could break through. Because if we don't, I mean, really, truly, the culmination of despair is either I take myself out, or it's the pathway of Cain, right? Which is, well, I'm going to punish you, God, for Dr. Jordan Peterson puts it this way: I'm going to punish you, God, for the crime of being. Um, uh, and I think that's an interesting interpretation of Cain and Abel. Like, I'm so resentful that you made my life this way. I'm going to retaliate against you by killing who you love most. And so the outcome of despair is either I take myself out or I take other people out. That's where it like meets its culminating point. And we fight against it, right? And we struggle against it. I think in part because we want to hold on to the possibility of hope. And we need the infusion of hope from an external source too, I think.
Yeah. What the word that came to my mind as you were kind of talking there was skepticism. That when I concede to despair, I live in that place of despair, not believing that anything is possible to move me out of it. Then I become skeptical to all other influences, which can keep me. It can keep me in a place where I'm perpetuating the reality of my despair.
Right.
And like you kind of said, it's really interesting. Wounded people are often the best at wounding others. Of perpetuating our pain for whatever reason. It's interesting. Are we perpetuating our pain or inflicting it upon others so that we just have more people like us around us, which makes our despair not feel as despairing because it's more normalized, as opposed to I'm a strange person in this dark hole.
Yeah, I also think if I'm increasingly cynical, then I wouldn't allow anybody the opportunity to engage me with hope. But also that would keep me safe from somebody hurting me. If I can keep you away, you couldn't hurt me. So I think that's a possibility. But I think there's also a flip side. People that have been hurt deeply also have the capability to be the most nurturing and compassionate and loving. Right? Like there's a.
Sure.
I think there's a thin line between despair and hope, and the redemptive move can shift somebody from, like you said, hurting self or other people to providing like a beautiful capacity for love and kindness and compassion. There's a reason why a lot of people that go into the mental health field are pretty, or they need to get well acquainted with their own past pain, because that's a driver for them wanting to like redeem their past experience. Yeah. And so I think, both possibilities are in play.
I know a lot. I have lots of friends in areas of ministry, rehab, those kind of places that have just come out of that very journey, and I was just had lunch with a buddy of mine from Full Circle Recovery Services. It's an organization here in the Dayton area that helps heroin addicts, drug addicts come out of addiction, and it's long-term care. And he was addicted himself and talks about his story, and yet he is able to reach and serve and minister to people in ways that most people can't because of his experience. And you said it so well. There's that thin line between hope and despair, and I think between skepticism and empathy too. Where when we move out of the reality of our despair and brokenness, and we see a world of possibility, oftentimes because of the influence of someone else, all of a sudden what was once skepticism can quickly turn to empathy, because we can see others and we can empathize. Like, I've been where you are. For me, that's the story of Christ. It's the story of redemption at its core, right? For a God to come in and say, "Oh, all you humans, let me save you," and just poof down and fix all the problems, which is oftentimes what we perceive we want from God. Instead, he did something that was really confusing to humanity. He entered into our mess. He entered into our despair, into the reality where we had conceded to the presence of death, and Jesus entered death itself, not just to claim victory over it, but I think it's exactly what we're talking about here. Jesus took the very symbol of despair and concession of death, and he transformed it into the most powerful beacon of hope and life. And really, it becomes our pathway to life. That we, this Bible says these weird things like, in order to have life, you have to lose your life. In order to live, you have to die. So it's this surrendering, this receiving love from a God who's been where we are, in order to transform our lives, to be able to see the pain of others and invite them into a better place. And I think just the symbol of Jesus is exactly what we're talking about here. He entered despair and flipped the switch, transformed it into a source of life.
Well, goes through it.
Yeah,
bears all of it.
So he can uniquely identify with us, whereas before he couldn't. You can make the theological claim that he couldn't,
but bears all of it, goes through it, and I think shows us that there's something on the other side. Because I think one of the things that's terrifying about despair is if I allow myself to grab on to hope, to believe that something might be different, if I'm wrong and the world crushes me again, or you hurt me again, I cannot do that.
Yeah.
Like the risk is too great to me. And so I'll stay here because at least I'm well acquainted with this pain. The disappointment, I don't know what that's like, but I have a sense that would be really, really bad. And I think you saying, this personification in Jesus, that there is a pathway through, and that there is light and truth and life somewhere else on the other side, and that there's a God who did it and will join you and do it with you, I think is a foundation for having hope. And I think it's also an example for us as people as far as what to do with despair. It's not to give trite remarks about how it's just going to be all better.
Right.
It's actually following the example of entering in and saying, I'm going to enter into the darkness of your despair with you, but I'm going to hang on to my hope, who I am, and I'm going to hang in there with you and walk with you through, believing that there's something else. I think that's what I meant earlier about the intrusion from the outside, that we so often need in despair. Just think of somebody with depression, where the impact on the body of despair and depression is being immobilized. But not just that. There's a cognitive element where memories are gone. Like previous positive memories become inaccessible to someone. Whereas when they experience a lifting of depression, people will report memories that they can access now that they couldn't even remember before.
Wow.
Positive ones, good ones. And so there is a sense of participation, but there's also the sense of like rolling crushing of despair that, like, I think it's something we have to make a choice to believe and participate in hope, and we need intrusion from the outside.
Yeah, I love that intrusion from the outside. So we need somebody to reach out to us and walk through it with us.
Break in.
Yeah. Here's something else I think we should talk about, because I was just talking with my team about Good Friday, and we started talking about this reality that came to mind as you were talking. So I'm in despair. Somebody enters into my pain, which is exactly what empathy is. Let's just be clear. As we were talking about that a second ago, empathy. I've crossed the threshold into hope. Now I can see someone else's life, and I can truly say I've been where you are, which is powerful when you reach out and say, I want to walk with you where you are. Right? It's totally different than somebody who hasn't been where I am and I know it, as opposed to someone who's been right in your situation, circumstance, can reach in a uniquely powerful way and say, I've been here. I know what it feels like to be where you are, and I know the way forward. Right? Good Friday coming up. We're talking with our team about how there's no resolution for Good Friday. Right? The challenge with Good Friday is Jesus goes to the cross and he dies, and that's the end of the service. And we all leave Good Friday in darkness, right? Jesus is swallowed up by death, and we know the hope of Easter is coming. But for his disciples, 2,000 years ago, Jesus entering death was despair personified. The resolution to all of the pain and brokenness that they had experienced in the world, all of their hope resided in Jesus being alive, and he was no longer alive. And there's something about Good Friday where I almost see this image of Jesus standing in the darkness of despair and death, and just barely seeing his hand from the confines of just consuming darkness. And his invitation to us is, here, take my hand and walk into this darkness with me. And as if the hope resides somewhere just beyond, we can't see it. And he's taking us somewhere that is outside of the confines even of our ability to communicate to him. What I'm trying to get at here, I think, is that oftentimes in hope we have an expectation of what that hope means, right?
Sight.
So I have despair, and there's a certain resolution to certain situations in my life that will set me free from despair. But sometimes the challenge of walking with someone in darkness or walking with God out of despair is, I think, really scary, because we confuse resolution with restoration. Where we want God to fix A, B, and C because those are the causes of my despair, right? Broken relationship, I don't know, fill in the blank. You could probably, trauma, people hurting others, all kinds of abuse, oppression, fill in the blank for you, whatever you've experienced, listener, even. And we have a definite expectation of, okay, I got despair. God, I'll walk through the darkness with you as long as it equals you resolving A, B, and C, because that's what hope means for me. But it's hard. What happens when those things they're not resolved? What happens when that those situations are still present? Can we experience hope outside of the realm of resolution of those things? And I'd like to hear you talk about that just a little bit, Rob. What happens for a person who's in the midst of despair and can't move forward because they're not experiencing like things that are causing their despair to be fixed? At some level, how do we let go of that and find a different way? Which is what I believe Jesus invites us to, that he's not necessarily interested in resolving our problems. What he's interested in is restoring our lives through his presence with us, which is a topic for another day. But I don't know. I just encounter a lot of people who confuse those things, that if I don't have my things resolved, then I don't have hope, because my hope is resting in those things. Does that make sense, or am I just rambling on?
Yeah, it does. No. What had me thinking of, I think there's real, in what we can see, restoration is resolution. I think it's hard for us to see anything else, for understandable reasons, because it's the dark, right? And so I think that's the real challenge is, the creative possibilities that we can't see, we don't know them. And it is a major act of faith to walk into the unknown, into the dark, and take a risk that life could be better, but in ways that I can't understand. And by better, that doesn't always mean like something is resolved. Some things may, absent some sort of like, divine miracle, they are the way that they are. And we don't have an explanation for why. We won't get justice. It's not fair. But like I was saying earlier, a path down that road is death, right? Of bitterness and hatred and resentment and despair leads to death of myself or other people. And entering into the dark, I see, like you're talking about, this hand that says, hold on to my hand as we walk through the dark. That's scary. But also it means that there's possibilities out there that you can't see that might be incredibly meaningful to you, even in the midst of who you are and what's happened. Because as I've worked with people who've undergone their own personal transformation, and experienced in my own life or seen family or friends, the pains and the residual effects of the past don't disappear. But that doesn't mean that new things don't come in.
Ooh,
And that's actually one big aspect of what therapy is oftentimes for people, or meeting someone at a church that loves you, um, you may not be able to replace someone's, whoever it is, fill in the blank, husband from the past or parent, or you won't be able to do that, but you can be uniquely you in the moment with that other person. And so there's the possibility of new things, not replacing the old, but new things that are good. But that requires a willingness to accept them as gifts instead of our anger at God or other people for what has been taken from us. And that's a courageous move. That's really difficult to do. But those are the things that are possible there, I think. And that's why I say we as people have such a responsibility, not just to need this for ourselves from other people, but to follow the example of what you're talking about of Christ, which is don't just stand back and wait for God to break into someone's life with light and truth and presence. Be that, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the message of Easter, is be that to other people.
Yeah.
One of them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I think this talk of someone entering in and us being that hope to someone ultimately brings in this reality of connection, right? So when the hand reaches out from the darkness, the deciding factor for me to walk into that darkness to whatever lies beyond, and I loved how you described that, the possibility of something new, right? That I can't see, but hope that it's there. And really that moment of moving into the darkness in hopes that there's light beyond is a moment of trust, that whoever's hand is being offered to me, that it's, man, what a courageous act of trust to grab someone's hand like that and walk somewhere that you can't see, that you can't imagine what's beyond, but somehow there's been a connection between you and that person who's entered into your life to place your trust in them. And I think both in relationship, communally, as we reach into one another's lives, how we establish trust and empathy, again, I think is such a huge part of that reality to as we walk into someone else's darkness, they hear our story, we've been where you are, establishes the reality that you and I are like one another. We've been where each other has been, establishes trust, but also in the reality of relationship with God. Moving our experience of God from our heads into our hearts, which was, I believe, where trust resides, right? It's this emotional human connection of, I'm not just going to say, I trust you. Trust, like, I'm putting my whole self into your hands, into this relationship where you're leading me somewhere new. I was just struck by how profound I think that is, how important trust is, and really how that oftentimes then becomes a barrier to moving out of despair, because oftentimes people who are broken and living in deep darkness, one of the hardest things for them to do is to trust, because everybody around them has proven over and over again that they can't be trusted. And that might be interesting for us to talk about, even just from a practical sense. If you're listening today and maybe you can really identify with that reality, you've brokenness, trauma, darkness, despair, and the answer requires trust. Like, what a cruel joke.
Right.
God says, walk with me into the darkness. Well, I've been failed over and over and over again. Why would I do that again? How does one who's had their trust broken over and over again, it's like, I was talking to a lady just yesterday, community, that she feels alone and isolated, and yet the thing she's most terrified to do is the exact thing she needs in order to have community. It's putting herself out there and making some new connections, but she's terrified of that.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same thing with trust.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. It feels cruel to say, that thing that you need to do is in the darkest place and the hardest place. But I mean, the alternative for me and the alternative for you is, if we don't do that, the alternative is usually hatred and resentment and bitterness, that then leads to us, in some way perpetrating or creating what has caused us so much pain, where we abandon or neglect or hurt the people around us. And it's not fair, but it's also it's our best. I mean, on a practical side, it's our best available option is to lean towards hope and trust and goodness, because the alternative is so terrible. And I think in a relationship that is redemptive, you also have the chance that someone could grieve with you, that someone could see what's been done and acknowledge it and believe you, and to say, yeah, that's the truth and it's wrong, and it's terrible, and I'll mourn with you, because there's either mourning or there's hatred and bitterness and resentment, and so if we lean into trust, we might find someone who would mourn with us, and then through that we might be able to find ourselves to a place of being able to give again, to love again, to create again instead of to just be in destruction. So yeah, it's not fair, but it's our best alternative.
I heard something I feel like is deeply practical out of what you said, is that I think to move out of your despair, if you're someone you're like, yeah, I'm here, I'm in this place of darkness, that your best move is to find people like you, people who are where you are, and to talk about where you are. I think in mutual shared experience is where trust can begin to grow, and most of the time, and I think that's why groups like AA and counseling groups and grief share groups are so powerful, is because we enter into a community of shared empathy, where we're being authentic about our own experience, whether we're in the grips of despair or we've moved beyond it because we've been where you are. I think that is such a beautiful and oftentimes just the first step to creating space where you can begin to recognize that there is somewhere other than where you are. This isn't the only reality you're going to ever experience. And so taking a small step of finding a support group or finding a counselor you trust, come talk to your pastor or a church community where you can feel safe enough to say, man, I am in the dark right now. And that's true.
Yep. There's two practical elements to that. Is seek out somewhere where there is light shining, and so because a support group or AA, when they function well, there are people in the AA group that are further along, and they're not in the midst of despair, but they have been in despair, in a church or a therapist or some, seek out light where you see it. And by light, I mean, people who are kind, people who tell the truth. Those two often are hard to put together. We're often either
that's funny.
so when looking for light, and then finding a person who is kind and tells the truth, then doing some of your own sharing. You've talked about vulnerability. I've talked about confession and telling the truth. Taking an action to open up to light, someone who may be hopeful and truth-telling and kind. Those would be some practical steps, because we talked before, and you can't guarantee that a church is going to be a place of light, or that a therapist will be, or that an AA group will be. You can't guarantee it, because we talked at the beginning about veneers, right? Like, places can look and appear like they are places of light, and also be filled with darkness. And so look for the practical, outflow. Oh, this person has hope, and they're also not faking it, and they're telling the truth, or this place or this therapist or whatever, and then take an action to share where you're at and the actual despair you're in. Because remember, the way out is through, not pretending like you're not. And so begin to share some piece of it, and see if you can build trust with that person, and see if they're willing to walk with you.
Yeah, such good stuff. And so it's just it connects to where my heart's been this whole series we've been on at Living Hope, and talking about mental wellness and anxiety, depression, despair, brokenness, and how to move forward from that, And I think there's something though that has been kind of inkling in my heart, and maybe this is just a conversation for another episode, but I think as part of this is oftentimes in spiritual experience, there are some of the most profound redemptive moments of ancient seekers and wanderers' journeys have been in deepest darkness. And there's some kind of spiritual principle that's really hard and really challenging, but also really hopeful, is that yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So there's this person who, right?
Why don't I fear evil?
And the reality is they're in the valley, and sometimes again this goes with this resolution idea that we get this idea that hope means I'll never enter another valley again in my life, or hope means I'll never have another experience of deep darkness and wounding, which is for me just such a tragic lie, because the reality is you might take someone's hand and walk out of the despair that you're in now. But if your hope rests in like this belief somehow that you'll never experience another moment of trauma or despair again in your life, you're setting yourself up for more trauma. Because I think life is just this seasonal ebb and flow of moments of great hope and joy, and also moments of deep despair and sorrow, and finding our way to kind of changing our view, I think, is really helpful. And I think that's part of a faith journey. What it kind of matures in us, or what's the word? It kind of brings. It just kind of develops in us as it's our ability to, wherever we are in life, to see with a perspective that what might this season I'm in teach me about being a more whole version of myself, if that's God's intention for me, and not that God brings us or creates darkness or creates trauma. But I do believe that God uses the circumstances of brokenness and evil in our lives. I mean, it's all throughout the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. Go read the story. It's a story of people like us who are in the midst of some of the darkest times of their life, and yet God redeems them and shows them how they can connect with him in a way that they never could have had they not been in the place of darkness. And I think that's another tough conversation and a tough reality. But also, for me, I've experienced it as one of my most hopeful encounters of faith and relationship with God, is the new perspective that when I walk into darkness, instead of just fearing despair, I now am conditioning my own heart and mind to look for, okay, where can I find God in the midst of the darkness? Because he's here with me, and he could do something. Like, this darkness holds the potential. Like, imagine that that God could even transform your view of trauma, grief, and despair into a view of, man, I wonder what God's going to do in the midst of this horrible thing. Like, it transforms my perspective into expectation rather than dread, and not like in a masochistic way, but that darkness could hold,
Well, and for those of us that aren't in the midst of despair, that's something that we have to hold on to, for people that may not be able to see it, because that the rest of that verse, right? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, right? For you are with me. And being a person in despair, knowing that someone is coming, or knowing that someone is with you, allows for hope. And whether that's God and the experience of a spiritual connection with God, and also a person around us, I think that's what helps us to be able to experience that. Because I totally agree. The treasure is to be found in the darkness where the dragon dwells, and beautiful treasured things come out of that. It doesn't mean that the terrible things are good, but we have to go there to get the treasure, and that's, I think, what God is calling us into, as he says, I'll go into the darkness with you, because on the other side is your transformation, whatever that might be. the transformation of the belief that someone would love you, for example, or the transformation of your belief that you're worthless, or the transformation of any number of things can come about through the course of that pathway. So my encouragement to you and myself and those that might be listening is, if you're in despair, knowing that there's the possibility for hope, and that you're not messed up or bad if you can't hold hope. But what I would encourage you to do is to hang on to the belief that someone or God could be with you. And for those of you and us that aren't in the midst of despair, to commit to be someone that follows after that example, which is, I'm going to enter in and I'm going to find someone who's walking in shadow and be with them. You can't be with everybody, and you have to make choices about what you can do, but also choose someone in your life to reach out to and try to meet them in their despair, not to fix it, but to join them and walk with them so that they can discover exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Cool.
Good stuff, man. What a great conversation, dude. I love it.
Yeah. Let's be people of hope,
Yeah,
right? Try to foster it and bring it about.
Absolutely.
So, hey, thanks, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's good talking.
We did it. And we were on video the entire time.
We'll see if it happens. So,
Yeah.
again, thank you, those of you that are listening. And again, just appreciate your interaction. Reach out to us on socials. You can email us at staringintothesunpodcast@gmail.com. Subscribe and share so that we can bring what we're doing to more people.
And you can actually watch this right on YouTube. Our YouTube channel, Staring Into the Sun. We're going to be sharing it on socials, so you can get on. It's another thing to subscribe to. We'd love for you to subscribe to both podcasts, but YouTube. Follow us on YouTube so that you can get notifications when we post new things. And even when we are live online, we would love to see some of you in live streaming, commenting with us and interacting with us right as we're recording. That'd be great interaction for sure.
As we get better at the tech, we'll notify people that we are going to be streaming live, and we be glad to have you join us. And in the future, we'd love to do more personalized ones, Q&As and things like that we can do. But this is us getting started, so we're trying to meet you where you are, whether you're on YouTube or a podcast. So thanks again for joining us. We encourage you to pursue hope, pursue people in despair, and join us next time too as we continue staring into the sun.
Grace and peace, everyone.
God is like the sun. You cannot always look at it, but without it, you cannot look at anything else. The way we find ourselves is by staring into the sun.